the time where Brother George was being trampled down. That knee, knee that was on his neck for 8 minutes 46 seconds will double it, and will also allow Brother Kwembu Tato Mahogodi to can unpack as well the international front of how do we look at the issues of racism. Not forgetting that the same country that is hosting this webinar had a conference on racism, and America ran away from that conference in 2001. And Professor Horace Campbell happens to have been in that conference. So we are privileged in this webinar to have such knowledge and that repository that will assist us. I don't know whether Brother Aza is ready to render an a cappella, to render a song for us to start to observe this moment of the webinar on United Against Racism, and we say white supremacy must fall, black power must rise, and all black warriors who have been killed near and far, we are calling their spirit. Can we have Dr. Horace Campbell? Dr. Horace Campbell, can we give you the floor because of the technicalities? But we know African ancestors are there. We are giving you the floor just to hit now because we can't wait for that other time. Thank you, Dr. Horace Campbell.
Good afternoon, comrades, brothers and sisters. I am pleased to be here with my brothers and sisters in all parts of the world in this platform to discuss why we must continue to unite and organize African peoples against racism, against capitalism, against imperialism, against militarism, and to overthrow white supremacy. So thank you for this opportunity. As you said, yesterday, all over the world, we commemorated the life of Walter Rodney and his service to the African Revolution and people's dignity, and his struggle to unite the Indian and African workers of Guyana, for which he was assassinated. And you rightly pointed out, in the global Pan-African movement in North America, on next Saturday, we will celebrate African youth and Juneteenth together. So this is a moment of heightened political organizing, political mobilizing, and the raising of consciousness. As you pointed out, George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, African Liberation Day. That day has been set aside and celebrated as the day when we remember when Black people have been struggling for dignity. Many of the African leaders are afraid of African Liberation Day, so they call it Africa Day. But they cannot change the history of the struggles of the African peoples. Since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, people have been rising up in the United States, in 400 communities, in the most remote areas of the United States, against white supremacy, racism, and the massive protests in the United States of America have brought solidarity from all parts of the world, in every corner. And yesterday, in discussing Walter Rodney in Jamaica, we were pleased that the African Union has made a very clear statement on the killing of George Floyd. And we call on the African youth in all parts of Africa to mobilize, educate themselves again about white racism in the United States of America. The President of the United States of America and the Trump administration, in response to the militarism, they have called on the military, and they've called on the military to dominate the streets. The Trump administration followed up by calling in the military into the urban areas and the National Guard. Now, this uprising has affected every institution in the United States of America, whether it is the university, the foundation, the sports arena, and the military. It is especially important the impact of this uprising on the military of the United States of America. Because although the chairperson of the Joint Chiefs of Staff joined with President Trump to march and move the young people out of Lafayette Square on June 1st, a week later, he apologized for marching with the President of the United States, his commander in chief. But the chairperson of the Joint Chief of Staff did not apologize because of his love for Black people or because he opposed white supremacy. He apologized because they are afraid of the rising consciousness in the military among Black, brown, and progressive white people. And they are afraid that the military in the United States will split and there will be a civil war. The United States president has already given signal to this direction by promising to invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act. So while the president of the United States has no legal basis for invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act, the fact is that it is part of the desperation of the ruling elements in the United States of America because they want, at this moment of the capitalist crisis, to abrogate the basic democratic rights of the citizens of the United States of America. And we must understand that this killing of George Floyd took place at a moment of the convergence of the health pandemic, militarism, economic depression, racism, chauvinism, xenophobia, and we should remember that it was precisely at a similar moment in 1933 that brought the fascists to power in Germany. So the progressive forces internationally, especially the United States of America, must be conscious of what this moment means in the period of global capitalism and the centrality of the military in the reproduction of white supremacy, white racism, and international capitalism. The United States military, for the past 20 years, have spent over $6 trillion fighting unjust, endless wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Somalia, and supporting their proxies in wars against the people of Yemen, trying to launch wars against the people of Venezuela, against the people of Cuba. So we are in a situation where global militarism as its reflection in the urban areas in the United States of America, because the same National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which was used by the United States Congress to launch the wars in Iraq and elsewhere, under the same law, the United States government has passed on billions of dollars to the police department to keep down Black people. So today, when we remember George Floyd, we are also naming the names of the more than 1,000 persons who are killed every year. Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner. The names are too numerous. Just Friday night, the police killed another Black man in the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. So the progressive forces in the United States of America are making the link between militarism abroad and militarism at home. Why is this militarism so pervasive at home in the United States of America? What is the position of the Black working peoples in the United States of America? After the Civil War in the United States of America, 1860 to 1865, at the beginning of the 20th century, Blacks moved into the urban areas when Black workers were needed. But in the era of deindustrialization, in the past 40 years, Black workers were not needed in the same way, so that the management of the urban areas required policing and the militarization of the urban areas in the same way as we have the militarization of the planet to keep United States capitalism going. And it is in this military management of the urban areas where the Black working people meet the brunt of the US military oppression. And we see this in the killing of Black youths every day. We see this every corner of the United States of America with the killing of Black youths. So mainstream politicians will talk about reforms and talk about how to make the police more accountable. But the leadership of the movement against capitalism and white supremacy has created a new political situation in the United States and internationally. The leadership is calling for the dismantling of the military in the United States, defunding the police, demilitarizing the Black community, and demilitarizing all public spaces. So we need to understand the demands of the youth, because the media, as one of the institutions of international capital, the NGOs, the public paid intellectuals will seek to distort what the Black Lives Matter stand for. So many people talk about Black lives, and I would want to say to my young brothers and sisters in Africa, what the Black Lives Movement stands for. What is important about the Black Lives Matter movement is who and which forces came to become the leaders of the Black Lives Matter forces. It's not by chance. That is our transgender brethren and sistren who have emerged as a leadership, because in the past 30 years, the Black church has been compromised by the conservative, homophobic forces inside the Black community that derailed the progressive liberation theology that existed within the Black spaces. So the Black Lives Movement emerged at a very decisive moment to oppose United States capitalism. How is it that in the country, in the world, that is supposed to be the most technologically advanced, that when a small virus like COVID-19 emerged, that in this country where 2 million people are affected and over 110,000 people have died, that 60% of those people who have died are Black and brown peoples. It is in this context that we have to understand the centrality of the Black Lives Matter movement and to see the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to spend a minute so that we can direct you to studying the platform of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2016, in the midst of the political campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, in August, the Black Lives Matter produced their 6-point document. And it is important that people understand the 6-point document, because many of our brothers and sisters in Africa and elsewhere support Black Lives Matter without going to support the program of Black Lives Matter. Number one, the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for ending the war on Black people and the criminalization and dehumanization of Black people. Number two, The Black Lives Matter movement is calling for reparations, past and present crimes, including redlining, the reformulation of cultural and educational institutions. And in this light, we have seen all over the world people calling for the removal of statues like Cecil Rhodes, Christopher Columbus, King Leopold, and all of the images of white racism or white supremacy. Number three, invest and divest. To invest in housing, to divest from the military establishment, to invest in universal health care. You will notice that in the political campaigns of the mainstream politicians, in the midst of the COVID-19, they will not discuss the need for universal health care and the fact that it's the Cuban medical system that is pointing the leadership of the world in how we fight COVID-19. Number four, economic justice and reconstruction. Number five, democratic community control. Number six, political power, independent Black political power, and Black self-determination. Now, it is very important that we understand that although as the Black Lives Matter has proclaimed the leadership, the progressive forces in all other sectors of the population understand the importance of this platform and this platform. Hence, we see young, progressive white youths in all parts of the country, from the environmental justice movement, the peace movement, the gun control movement, the LGBT movement, the anti-immigration race movement, the anti-Islamophobic movement. The Black Lives Matter have created a unique political force to fight against capitalism at this particular historical moment. So we are now seeing how the state is seeking to respond to this crisis of capitalism. They have, in the past 3 months, given themselves more than $6.3 trillion. How is it that the federal government of the United States of America can give $6.3 trillion to capitalists to bail them out when the majority of the masses of the people in the United States are continuing to suffer, dying from COVID, unemployment, with a food crisis? Let me repeat myself. If the economists are saying that this crisis is deeper than the Depression of 1929, and it will be more profound than the crisis of 1929. If the 1929 crisis brought us the intervention of imperialism in Ethiopia, brought us the rise of fascism, brought us World War II, what will be the outcome of this crisis of capitalism? We have already seen with the intervention in Libya and the wars against the people of Iraq, Iran, China, Cuba, Venezuela, that the military instincts of capital is to resolve the crisis of capitalism by military means. So the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States of America, the movement of peace and justice, is calling on peoples in all parts of the world to remove and oppose US militarism, US white supremacy, and US capitalism. What will be the response if the United States intensify its plans to invade Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China, and other parts of the world? In the Black liberation movement, the Black Lives Movement in the United States of America, the people have made it very clear that they will intensify the opposition to capitalism, and that the mobilization of the people is to do what is being done in Seattle, in Minneapolis, create spaces of safety for the people so the people have control and democratic control over their communities. The struggle against capitalism, the struggle against racism requires a new level of political consciousness, new levels of solidarity, and new forms of organizing. And it is part of our responsibility to those who have gone before us to ensure that the capitalists cannot resolve this financial and economic crisis by killing millions of people. Already, millions are dying from COVID-19 when the technology exists and the scientific and medical wealth exists to be able to resolve these questions. This discussion should be part of a general struggle for the dignity of people fighting racism, capitalism, and white supremacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Horace Campbell. And I think on this note, as you have unpacked it very well, that we should look at racism in the light of as well as capitalism. And I think we have raised it very clear. I think this is an opportunity to bring Tato Wa Makokodi, the co-founder of Kodiso Sechaba, one of the internationalist activists, a student activist from Koma Ikeng. Tato Wa Makokodi has been very active in the struggles, and he has been even a part of this what you said, political consciousness. And I think this is the opportune time to give Tato Wama Kokodi this opportune time, but to welcome everybody who's watching us, as well as our national public broadcaster, SABC, for giving us this opportunity to have this voice that is coming from the continent. We are still saying this is a webinar that is talking about Africa united against racism. We say Black lives are precious and white supremacy must fall. Tato Wama Kokodi, the platform is yours, my brother.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sipho Mantula, Mwafrika Mantula. We are being too serious. Maybe we must break a bit into song and say, from Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar, from Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar. Happy George Floyd is our brother. We won't let him go unnoticed. Happy George Floyd is our brother. We won't let him go unnoticed. A white supremacy must fall. Get down with racism now, down. Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, fellow Africans, Master of Ceremony, Mwafrika Mantula, Dr. Desta Megu, Professor Horace Campbell. Perhaps to capture the mood of this occasion, as a welcome from the Kodiso Sechaba Foundation, Kodiso Sechaba Yama Africa. Perhaps we must begin by saying that we stand combat ready to fight back at this racism. As all of us gathered here today surely do, it is because we've been privileged to stand on the shoulders of giants like you. Professor, it is your generation that has taught us that to complete the Renaissance project of this continent, it is going to be important that we confront the last bastions of racism that exist in the world today. Piri George Floyd has reminded us with his life that with racism still alive, the black man will still not be able to breathe. With racism still alive, we will not have a functional and peaceful global community, because we will fight back if those entrusted with the law will continue to be the very breakers of that law. With racism still alive, we will not have a functional global community. With racism still alive, the commanding heights of the global economy will still be in the hands of whites. And we will continue to be tempted as the downtrodden to use counterfeit dollar bills in order to purchase the goods we need to survive. With racism still alive, human rights violations against the black body will remain more pandemic than COVID-19. You know, a year after we had ushered in our own democracy in South Africa, a year after we thought that we had at least destroyed apartheid politically, a South African author by the name of Zanemvula Zakes Mda penned and published a book called Ways of Dying. In the seminal introduction of this book, Zakes Mda starts by building a character of a young man who's been destroyed and murdered by the system, by the enemy. As a premonition of what we are going through today, the tome begins by saying, I open quotes, there are many ways of dying. The nurse shouts at us. Pain is etched in his voice and rage is mapped in his face, but we listen in silence. This, our brother's way, is a way that has left us without words in our mouths. Close quote. George Floyd should not have died this way. His departure symbolically reminds us of the passing of Hector Peterson as we celebrate June month in South Africa, the death of Chris Hani, Stephen Bantu Biko, your Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Samora Machel. All of these Africans, all of us would remember, perished at the literal and proverbial suffocation of this very knee, whose purpose was to ensure that the lives of these Africans does not continue, because it defined a direct threat to control of global affairs by the white capitalist system. Now, the passing of George Floyd and the others in recent history, in my view, should be meaningfully a stark reminder to all of us as Africans, to all of us as Blacks in general and Africans in particular, that we should stand united against this scourge of oppression of the human being, but particularly this anti-racism, which is a manifestation of white supremacy. Our unity as Africans in this regard is sacrosanct. And perhaps we must play it like a cassette, repeatedly in our ears in a language that we will all hear as Africans, and perhaps say in Kiswahili, mini naha mini umoja, wakati ya kaka na dada sanzo katika bara ya Afrika. Mini naha mini umoja, wakati ya kaka na dada sanzo katika bara ya Afrika. Therefore, counting all of these things to make a very clear point of sending a very clear message to those who are still racist, wherever they exist in the world, that as Africans in general, as Blacks in general and Africans in particular, from Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar, and beyond into the tentacles of the diaspora, we are no longer prepared to play pool until the rules of the game have changed. Victory and game over must now mean that the black ball can now sink the white ball. For us to remind ourselves that indeed We are equal human beings after all. This, our brother's way, is a way that has left us without words in our mouths, but political pangas in our hands, ready to fight back at this racism, which is a manifestation of white supremacy. We say all of these things because we know that we as blacks cannot be racist. We simply do not have the powers to be. And maybe to reclaim our breath as Africans, we need to call upon Africans across the diaspora. We need to call upon all revolutionaries, black and white, in the next 8 days to boycott all symbols of Americanism and really say to white American shops that they too must experience not breathing in the next 8 days. 8 is now our new political number, in tribute to the experience of 8 minutes and 46 seconds that George Floyd had to endure. Under the brutal knee of that policeman, Derek Chauvin, the Derek Chauvinist racist bigot, and his accomplices, white policemen in the cold streets of Minneapolis. Because this, our brother's way, is a way that has left us without words in our mouth, but bullets and political pangas in our hands, ready to fight back at this racism, which is a manifestation of white supremacy. So the message as Kodisos Chaba that we want to send is, as we demand freedom and equality for George Floyd and the others, we must begin to push, pursue, and prevail in a message that says white supremacy must fall and the time is now. But move beyond the slogans to the substance and define in clear terms what needs to be done in order for us to reverse this white supremacy. And in my view, it should begin to include concrete things, like confronting the whole question of defining for ourselves as Africans an antithesis to white supremacy, which must include how do we ensure that Africa now gets a permanent seat on the UN Security Council? Because the world is still operating on the political dynamics of the Second World War. Hitherto, as the world changes today, Africa must have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And we must capture this revolutionary moment as things that must begin to say, we want to see Africans also having power in global affairs. And the UN is an important pocket of that power. And at this moment, to show that these whites are not racist, they must give the African countries a permanent seat. We must also talk about the concrete question of meaningful economic participation in the commanding heights of the global economy, beyond the slogans to the substance of ensuring that we are able to control our minerals and the way they would flow. And
we are losing you.
For the benefit of the hoi polloi in the condition of education. So in conclusion, I'm saying the time has come for us to move from slogans to substance. And most importantly, we must define the antithesis of white supremacy in very clear terms. And we have created this platform for us to begin to create a frame of that discussion. As I've said, with those few words, let us welcome everyone who's here. Let the discussion continue. Thank you very much.
Asante sana, Comrade Koimbutato Mahodi. As you have said it mouthfully, that for the coming 8 days, let it be, we must be pushing for African in the living spot and the diaspora to start to boycott the Americanization or American product. And I think we have captured very well that even if African countries have the non-permanent seat at the UN, there is a need for the African leaders as well to be fighting for the permanent seat. So it's a very important task. I don't know whether is Brother Azza on the line, just to drum a beat before we go to Addis Ababa now to Mama Testa, just to get another view from Addis Ababa, from Ethiopia. We have started from America from Prof. Horace Campbell coming to South Africa. Now we are going to Addis Ababa. Now is Brother Asa on the line? In the absence of Brother Asa with the drum, because in Africa, Walter Rodney reminded us that music and drumming and colors and heritage is very important. As we were celebrating Walter Rodney yesterday, the man who said how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and like you are saying, Tato, it's important to understand the global economy, to understand even the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization in this coronavirus period that we are in. Mama Desta, let me not waste any other time and to allow you to share your thoughts. And we are giving you that 8 minutes, 46 seconds, but you can add as you are in the capital city of Addis Ababa, you are in the land of Haile Selassie. Thanks, Mama Desta.
Oh, give thanks, give thanks. And first of all, let me honor our things and works has really helped to inform, educate, and enlighten. So we give thanks to all our other participants and panelists and chairperson, all protocols observed. Tanya Stilling, greetings from Addis Ababa. As you said, this is the diplomatic capital of the continent and the seat of the African Union. So it has both symbolic and substantive meanings that we need to ensure are part of this talk or this discourse. So I'd like to start by reading just a few lines from my column in the Capital. Essay is when parents discuss how babies are made and other pre-adult matters to prepare their children for body changes and overall youth development. For Black folks in America, the stopped in a store suspected of shoplifting wants to do a random locker search. And the list goes on. CNN commentator Van Jones refers to the talk as fairy dust that we sprinkle over Black children that leave home every day, praying that these words will protect them. As a mother of 5 Black sons raised in America, I have 10 children, 5 sons, 5 daughters. I know the talk too well. And now it's time to have the talk with Ethiopia and Africa in general, to prepare those not in the know for our desire to come home or at least be seen by Africa. We watched America from Wyoming to Washington, D.C., and for that matter, from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all over, swim in seas of protest in reaction to the police murder of George Perry Floyd. He did not just perish, he was murdered, and we have to ensure that we articulate it in the manner in which it was delivered. Responses from Africa spanned a spectrum of sentiments. On one end, quote, destruction is not the answer. This protest is embarrassing. They should gain education, self-knowledge, finance, gain respect. They don't appreciate the opportunities. That's one response. On the other hand, quote, African Americans are our children. Their ancestors were taken from Africa to build America for free. So burn it down if that's what it takes to stop cold-blooded killings on camera. In the middle of the spectrum, wow, we never knew it was really that bad. We should pray for the protesters and white people that God will change hearts and bring peace. The talk. The talk was placed on the table by African Union Deputy Chairperson, known as a pilot of Pan-Africanism at the AU, Ambassador Kwesi Kwartey, when he first posted on Facebook, quote, we may be Black, but we are people too. A floodgate of responses from African leaders, including Year of Return Diaspora Reintegration Champion, President Nana Akufo-Addo, emphatically stated, quote, it cannot be the right that in the 21st century, the United States, this great bastion of democracy, continues to grapple with the problem of systematic racism. The President's Office and Ghana Diaspora Coalition honored George Floyd at the Diaspora Africa Forum on June 5th, where the head of mission, Dr. Erica Bennett, said, George was our son, a son of Africa, and we'll place his name on the Sankofa wall amongst his ancestors and celebrate his short life, which ended waking up the world to institutional racism, reminding Africans at home that we need to be connected. So Ethiopia, Africa, let's talk. And let's talk about the role of the artist. Let's talk about the chanting that Rastafari has done from as early as the 1930s. Let's go back to Bob Marley when he sang Burning and Looting in 1973. He sings, quote, "This morning I woke up in a curfew. Oh God, I was a prisoner too. Could not recognize the faces standing over me. They were all dressed in uniforms of brutality. How many rivers do we have to cross before we can talk to the boss? All that we got, it seems we have lost. We must have really paid the cost. Burning and looting tonight, burning all pollution tonight, burning an illusion tonight." You know, artists have been chanting about this, speaking about this, sacrificing life and limb and see what fella went through. And when I say this, we're talking about the vestiges of, of, of colonialism, of the Ma'afa, of racialism, neo-colonial, manifest every day. It's no different here in the context in different ways. And our children are tired of it. I marched. Matter of fact, I marched against Trump in the 1980s as a young activist when he was involved in trying to indict. Well, he did end up having young, innocent black and brown boys sent to prison for a so-called attack on a white woman in Central Park. And then to see just a couple of weeks ago that bird watching while black in that same Central Park by a white woman weaponizing race, threatening him on the phone. I'm going to tell them that it's an African-American man. We haven't arrived. We haven't arrived, but I can say this safely and confidently. 4 months of being locked down, in some cases, converged with 400 years of brutality. And the rage that we see spilling over, not just in the US, but around the world, speaks to the perfect storm. And a time when we've all said, no more diplomacy. It's time for demands. Union and other African heads of states to push. And certainly we're thankful for Ghana's response. This is important to be able to say you have a home, you have a place, you have somewhere to come to. Equally important is to put structure in place. Equally important is to ensure that Africa's voice is powerful enough to protect its people. And we are its people. We were recognized as the 6th region over a decade ago. What does that mean? What does that mean? And how can we ensure that these young people who are taking to the streets and willing to risk their life, because with them it's what is there to lose, into the streets. And I want to emphasize again the role of the continent of Africa through the African Union and African heads of states. We have 55 countries. That's a strong bloc. And with the advent of the free trade agreement and gearing up to have free movement of goods and services across our 55 nation states, this is a powerful varicom. And the Black Caucus and anywhere where Black people dwell, South America, Brazil, it's time to galvanize. And the African Union needs to take its rightful place. It needs to be able to be leading this discourse without any apology or any fear. These young people are not asking, they're demanding. And we see what's happening. Let me share with you another article that I just wrote. Matter of fact, it comes out today in the Capital. It says, are we there yet? This is a familiar and frequent cry that our children say on those long trips. And frankly, maybe all of us are feeling that way now. Are we there yet? After months of stay at home and work from home due to COVID. And then there's the protest. days, weeks now, and counting. As I said before, convergence of 4 months of pent-up frustration from lockdown with 4 centuries of rage based on racism triggered by the police murder of George Floyd. Many said the protest will not yield anything. And sort of here we go again, because we've been burning. This is not the first time. We've documented protests in the United States from as early as 1609 in terms of Africans who have been there fighting for justice. So are we there yet? On the way. Certainly there's a list of demands that have been messed, including banning chokeholds in Minneapolis, defunding police budgets, such as what's happening in LA, Boston saying that they're agreeing to stop using public buses to transport police officers, taking down of monuments. And as I said before, all over the world, Mexico, Canada, Italy, Ireland, I could go down the list, right down to New Zealand, among other countries, have joined with the I Can't Breathe signs and protests representing both the last words of Floyd and the last words also murdered by police in Paris in 2016 in a familiar fashion. So the rage-filled removal of statues, though symbolic, was also another significant part of this protest. Leopold was targeted. The wicked man that we know massacred over 10 million in what is now known as Congo during the scramble for Africa. Cecil Rhodes also didn't escape with the Take It Down campaign, with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. So young people are getting out there, they're angry, they're hurt. And I can tell you that I, as a mother who thought that my generation of protesting that began through the 70s, we thought it would have been finished. We thought it would have been finished, but we know that racism is deep entrenched and even 400 years, because we've been fighting from the time they put us on that slave trip. Before they even put us on the ship, we fought. We were not taken away just as limp, wet, willing, let's go for a ride on this boat. No. We fought leaving and we fight coming home as we return. But as we move a block forward, the colonial mentality and white privilege takes us 2 blocks back. And this goes back to what Prof was saying about capitalism, because that is the color, the true color of racism. It's green, okay? And we are pawns. We are instruments in this social construct to keep us down and to keep us as a source of their income. And this came home deep to me this week when I read the article that, again, invaluable treasures, iconic treasures stolen from Africa by colonial powers and proudly displayed in European museums and private collections are set to come up for auction at Christie's and Sotheby's in the next week or so. According to Quartz Africa's Olawatosin, he says auctions of valuable African artifacts, some of which could be identified as candidates for repatriation to their lands of origin by activists, would be controversial in normal times, but particularly so during the ongoing global pandemic and its attendant economic fallout. And add to that, worldwide protests. Seriously, Sotheby's? Mercantile interests trump justice every time. And this Sotheby's last couple months ago, they had an auction of over 100 plus works from 58 artists across 21 African countries, yielding a massive 46 increase in sales, over $2.9 million. So money talks, but my bets are on the youth. My bets are on the youth to tackle this issue as well, shaming African countries to swap diplomacy for demands. So finally, right here at home, our brother Julius Malema reprimands even our brothers and sisters in South Africa and saying, let's think about this. This means we cannot kill our Mozambican brothers. This means we cannot kill Zimbabweans. We cannot stand up and just allow xenophobia and these things to happen, although we understand that these are minority. And we have to also bust the myth that it is all South Africans, because this is not the truth. But again, we know how media plays it. Divide and conquer. So as we look at where we are and where our young people are headed, and they're determined, they want to bring it down. And I am proud, I am happy. Many people, as I said, were quite embarrassed at first, oh, can't we just talk about this? Talk about what? We can go all the way back to a song like Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, which Nina Simone made popular. Strange Fruit, talking about the lynching, hanging of Black men by trees in the South. But I bring it home to a story of redemption, if you will, and a story of hope that was evoked by several words uttered by one of our ancients from Jamaica, the Nyabingi House, who has been in South Africa for the last several months with a delegation of ancients. And he said, "Too long have I been suffering in the wilderness. I want to come home. I want repatriation." So we have to look at these institutions of repatriation and reparations. These have to be policies enshrined in all member states that allow and understand the importance of recognizing us, reintegrating us, bringing us home, and not based on remittances. We were sold when we were living. That we were commodified when we were taken out of Africa. We don't want to be commodified again. We don't want to be told that this group is bringing in X amount of remittances and so forth. We want there to be a moral obligation, because we understand the legal implications of sovereign states when we say the sixth region. We're not naive, but we know how far acts of morality will go. This is what we're asking for: recognition, reintegration, re-embracing your children, your kith and kin who across the water are dying every single day. Every single day. And you know what? They don't care that this cop can look into a camera with hand in pocket calmly as a man is saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe," and not taking his knee up until every breath is out of his body. What more does our beloved African continent need to understand the importance of connecting, recognizing, and supporting and standing in solidarity with Africans in the diaspora? And in this case, particularly the United States, because I'm telling you, when I moved to the United States in the 70s, African Americans fascinated me. They had this creative genius, this ability to move through situations that many of us coming out of a Black country, I don't know how we could really handle it. And it is because they're African. It is because of the circumstances that they've been placed under that have created almost a superpower, a superhuman being that is resilient and is ironically able to affect society in such a word when you hear language and fist bump and bling bling, just these different little colloquialisms that are strung all the way through, everyday language that you hear, even on media houses and so forth. Hip hop, or not just America, but everything that we do. So if we can understand the importance and recognize this cultural heritage that our African brothers and sisters have taken across the water with them and have been able to manifest as a way to express themselves and as a way to keep their sanity, isn't it time for Africa to say, yes, let us really now stop the talking, no more talk shop, and do like Ghana, and do as Ethiopia did, as a matter of fact, as the first country to offer that land grant. This was post the Battle of Adwa, when Emperor Menelik saw what was going on and how this impacted and galvanized a seeding Pan-African movement in the late 1800s. And then His Majesty manifested this land grant post the running out of the fascists out of Ethiopia after they had occupied for 10 years. So we have precedents. We know that Africa has an interest. The issue is what to do and how to do it. And this is where we come in, the voice of the advocates, and again, the voice of the artists, and the voice of academicians that can share with the African Union and all member states how the best to engage. How do we go about this in a substantial way that also ensures that we build our economy with the resources that we have, so we're able to stand up anywhere we go. We're not looking as donies and beggars when we go to the table with these so-called partner conversations. So let us revisit our history. Let us look at what has worked in terms of connecting Africa and their kith and kin. Let us look at the role of artists and their responsibility. And most of all, let us keep the pressure on the African Union and on African member states. And as Frederick Douglass said, we have to agitate, 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 so we can end, demolish, dismantle, burn to the ground this thing called white supremacy, because it has no place in society anywhere on the face of this earth. And we replace it with something that Rastafari has always chanted: Black supremacy. And what was Black supremacy? It had nothing to do with superiority. It was Black people saying our lives matter. We're supreme, we're beautiful, love supreme. I have never heard the word black, 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 black so much and so many places in my lifetime. And I smile and I give thanks. And I give thanks that, Walter Rodney and so many of our brothers and sisters who fought and paved the way that we can stand here and sit today in the middle of the 21st century. Although we have not reached our aim, we're not there yet. I think we're decidedly on the road, and we thank our youth and we stand with our youth who unapologetically have said, we have nothing to lose. This is for the next generation. Let it not continue. So I give thanks for sharing my words, my passion. I feel this, as I said, as a mother, every day getting up in the United States and telling my Rasta dreadlock son what to do when they get in the car, what to do in PTA, that my children would not be, humiliated and feel disgraced as they do with our Black children. Dr. Joanza Kunjufu, he talks about this. So many have talked about this. So again, I give thanks. It is our time. Let's take it.
Amasenagalo, thank you very much. Asante sana ralebuha siyabonga, Dr. Testa. I think this was very important, and we want to acknowledge all the inputs, all the comments, all the knowledge that we have raised. Sister Testa, I think we were very sharp to be raising the youth as one community that we should be focusing on. You spoke about cultural heritage. Diplomacy must shift. You spoke about how we should put pressure on the African governments. But I think what is important, before we can even go to the closing remarks by Comrade Tato, to just say Africans, hashtag Africans United Against Racism. This was an inaugural webinar. We hope that we'll host it almost every week, every month, just to always resuscitate the mind of the young Black people. But I want to go back to Prof. Horace Campbell just to say one or two before we go to Kwembu, General Kwembu, Brother Tato, to say, Prof. Horace Campbell, the issue of the World Conference Against Racism of 2001. It was hosted by us here in South Africa. Can you just touch on it, and as the way of moving forward, and as well as we have raised the role of the media, is the media even perpetuating racism in some instance? And at the last point, Brother Horace Campbell, just to explain how can we infuse Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance to the young Black youth from Angola to Zimbabwe, including Caribbeans. So, Prof. Horace Campbell, just briefly, your insight on the World Conference Against Racism, as well as touching on the role of the global media.
Thank you. I was trying to be disciplined to stick to the time that was allocated. But let me say that the political leadership of South Africa absconded in its responsibility. The responsibility was delivered to the South African leadership by the youth and the struggling people of South Africa. And so when the World Conference Against Racism was launched as a continuation of the global struggles against racism, this was the third World Conference Against Racism. The second World Conference Against Racism is what designated apartheid a crime against humanity. Now, out of the World Conference Against Racism, there was a program of action. The South African government, the foundations, corporations in South Africa turned their backs on the declarations of the World Conference Against Racism. And in fact, within the universities and spaces of education, NGOs and foundations, there is no discussion of the agenda of the World Conference Against Racism. So thank you for bringing this back. The United Nations have been pressured by the African descendants. We are in the African descendants decade. It is the Africans in Brazil, Costa Rica, and someone like the Vice President of Costa Rica, Sister Campbell, Epsie Campbell, who've been at the forefront of reminding the world of this World Conference Against Racism. The South African political leadership retreated from the discussion on reparative justice. Reparative justice is very central to the World Conference Against Racism. Some people are thinking of reparations only in terms of money. But as you rightly pointed out, the role of educational institutional, the role of the media, the role of religious institutions, these are very core institutions in framing images about what lives are valued. And many African governments are afraid of the Black Lives Matter movement because those very same governments support xenophobia. One of the demands of the global Pan-African movement is Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. Let me state clearly that the unity, the integration of the peoples of Africa from Cape to Cairo is central to the freedom, independence, and end the white racism. I spoke in my delivery about the global capitalist crisis and the military management of the international capitalist system. One element of that is the role of the US dollar in international finance. The people of Africa will have to work towards the unification across border, freedom of movement for the African people, and for one common currency. Because one of the outcomes of the militarization of the planet and the war that is ahead of us is that the dollar will be diminished and the European Union will seek to intensify its control over Africa and African resources by strengthening the euro to fight the dollar. So we have a multi-currency world with the euro, the dollar, the Chinese currency, the Brazilian currency. All of these countries will seek to strengthen themselves at the expense of Africans. And the only way Africa can resist is to come together to unify the peoples of Africa across borders against all forms of xenophobia and to ensure we have a common currency. Now, the road to the common currency in Africa may not start with 55 countries. We may start with 5 countries, 6 countries. But we know from the experience of East Africa where the East African unified currency was strong 40 years ago, the Western countries broke up that unified currency. Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. Now, even if we started with those countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and then gradually bring in other countries, we need to move rapidly on the African currency. We cannot have an African free trade area without having that African currency. We cannot have an African free trade area without the freedom of movement of the African peoples. I agree with Sister Desta about the initiative of the government of Ghana, but we also need to remind the people of the world of the importance of the statements and position of Kwame Nkrumah in his call for the full unification of Africa. That the full unification of Africa requires that Africa has one military force, one diplomatic force, one currency force, one trading force. And I want to announce to people listening that there's a plan on the table to build a canal from the Congo to Lake Chad, to restore Lake Chad, to end the desertification in Lake Chad, and to lay the basis for the unification of Africa. And part of the Pan-African movement's responsibility is to popularize and to ensure that those African peoples that steal money from Africa and keep their money in foreign banks, that money is brought back for the reconstruction of Africa. President Thabo Mbeki chaired the commission of the African Union on illicit capital flight from Africa. That panel determined that every year $50 billion is taken out of Africa illegally. Part of the World Conference Against Racism program is to bring back the resources to Africa. So part of the reparations campaign, part of the campaign is that we should end stolen assets. There is something called stolen assets program of the United Nations. Most people do not know it. Instead, they promote what they call sustainable development goals. Sustainable development goals is to divert attention from the call to restore African assets. So let me say that the program of the Pan-African movement in the 21st century, first and foremost, is for the humanization of the planet Earth. The humanization of the planet Earth means that we must recognize all humans, and recognizing all humans means that we must oppose white racism, white supremacy, white chauvinism, and the ideas that they could fight to keep international capitalism by destroying Africa. Let me end by saying that in Libya today, there's a war going on between France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia on one side, and Turkey and Qatar on the other side. And the African Union has been comatose because they're compromised by countries like the Egyptian government that is part of that civil war to keep Libya divided. And why did they invade Libya? Because the president of Libya wanted to use the billions of dollars of the reserves of Libya to lay the basis for the African currency. The president of France said when they went into destroying Libya, we must fight to preserve the euro because they are afraid more than anything else of the African currency. But African currency cannot come from African leaders. If you go in West Africa, you see traders moving from Senegal down through Liberia, down through South Africa. African women and men who are traders already accept that there must be freedom of movement. They use currencies and use their knowledge of currencies in a way in which bankers do not understand. So it is for the formal institutions and economists and bankers to catch up with the African peoples on the ground. The African peoples on the ground already accept Africa for the Africans. And this thing about African diaspora, and I'm glad Sister Desta talked about this call for moving beyond what they called they call Africans sending remittances, that they recognize Africans only in relationship to remittances. The collective resources of Africa. First, their knowledge. Second, their language. Third, their mineral skills. The collective resource of the African peoples at home and abroad can change how human economies are organized. It is time for us to learn from Kwame Nkrumah and those who laid the foundations for the unification of the peoples of Africa to use this as the barrier to batter down international capitalism. Thank you very much.
Asante sana, siyabonga raleboga, Professor Horace Campbell. I think we've put it very clear as well about how Africa must wake up from its ashes, how Africa must be united. And I think Sister Desta, before, because I thought we have to allow you to have the shooting part. Dr. Desta, the issue of the violence against children and women in Africa, in the diaspora. And finally, the role of women in fighting racism and all forms of bigotry. And we can raise even many more. Apartheid that was in this country. So if you can just touch on those two issues, the role of African women, the black women, in combating the gender-based violence. I've said earlier on my introduction that South Africa, it is going through the wave of attack against the women and the children. But in Africa, how do we deal with that attack of women and children? And as well, the role of women in fight against racism, xenophobia, and Afrophobia, Sister Desta.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, no, I give thanks, and I just have to honor those words that Prof just shared with us, because we need to ensure that this message really goes out about, indeed, as we said, reparative justice within this the structure of reparations. It's not a check that we're talking about. Similarly, the role of women is more important today than I think it's ever been. And I think we have to understand that the power that we have has been robbed and has been redefined by colonial societies that try to introduce notions of feminism and things that are really false to us. Because African women historically were rulers. We were involved, we were warriors, we were fighters. And so the space that we find ourselves in now, and it's ironic because when I'm looking at these young women who are on the line in the United States, they're barely 25 years old. They're barely 25 years old, and they're out there fiercely, ferociously fighting, because, you know, we have a fire that burns in our belly, as we would say in Jamaica. And it is that feeling that your child, your next generation, you have to do everything that you can to protect. So I will say that there are moves that's being made. For instance, I don't know, you know, Mama Apsa, she's from Uganda, and she's with the UNDP. She's the liaison to the African Union for Peace and Security within the campaign of ending the guns, silencing the guns for 2020. And so we have women like this who barely 5 foot tall is going into the trenches and not just speaking to us, you know, the victims or the survivors of heinous crimes and weaponizing sexuality against women, but she goes in and speaks with the perpetrators. And this is important: communication, 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 and education. And it begins at home. Women have to begin to strengthen themselves, fortify themselves, so you know your child. Like I said, you have to have that talk. You have to have that talk very, very early, right here, even on the continent. Just as we mothers are having to talk about driving while black, being black, bird watching while black, we have to ensure that our children are prepared. They get education. they get as much exposure to truth as possible, so they're not trying to get on flimsy boats to go across the border for the Mediterranean to go to Europe for better horizons. We have a lot to do, but we are consistent. The women are consistent. When we look at the Pan-African Women's Organization, even before the OAU, that was established. So let us continue to give our sisters, our women, our mothers, our elders that is needed for them to indeed take back this helm, because hegemony, it's not going to work. All the Eurocentric notions and policies and principles that we put in place, whether you want to call it democracy, what is able to create these huge civilizations that encompassed everything from astronomy to brain surgery to accounting, calculus. How did we do all of this? Yet today, we need help, we need partners, we need to look at sustainability. No, it's not for permission. We're basically taking on our responsibility and our duty as the next generation is owed that. So that is my part on the role of the women. We'll never.
Amasenagalo, Sister Desta, we give thanks, Rale Bonga. I think, as we have said to those who have been following us, who have been watching it, the Facebook, it was General Kwembu. Want to thank the national broadcaster as well. But Brother Kwembu, Tato Makokodi will do the closing remarks. And as we say, this was our inaugural webinar. We have hoped to have traveled to Ghana, to have traveled to Kenya. We hope we will make that trip to Kenya and Ghana and many African countries, just to keep the momentum. And we say the hashtag Africans United Against Racism, Sexism, Violence, all forms that are to dehumanize the African child and the African mind. And we still want to say, we want to thank everybody who has been part of this, but I think Tato Wamakokodi will be the best person to do that. And we want to thank everybody who has been on the Zoom, Facebook, and who has taken his time. And as we are saying, this is in commemoration of George Perry Floyd, in commemoration of all those Black lives who have been killed, who have been lost, and the youth of 1976, and the youth of the African diaspora. So we have thought this is a webinar that will liberate the mind of an African youth. Comrade Tato Wa Makokodi, the platform is yours, as we are about to close this webinar on this Sunday afternoon.
Thank you very much. Yeah, technology is a problem in Africa. I thought I was trying to say that as a parting shot, we must go back to Lenin, who says that in order for us to achieve any revolution, and in this context, the African Renaissance Revolution, we need to answer two questions. What is to be done? And where to begin? I think we've successfully in these discussions today answered the question, what is to be done? Perhaps now we must answer the question, where to begin? In answering that question, I think the first answer to that question is to go back to the comments made by Professor Horace Campbell on this notion of revisiting the resolutions of the World Conference Against Racism, which all of us know, which we had turned our backs against, to petition our governments to really go back to those resolutions from an implementation point of view and define clear government programs for all African countries around those resolutions. The detail, of course, is a matter that we can have separately. The next question of where to begin is to reanalyze our understanding of the international balance of forces and the implications for this continent. In doing that, a cardinal matter that we need to recognize is that the current international balance of forces have shifted. the country that murdered George Floyd used to be a superpower. And I'm using those words currently, used to be a superpower, because I have a view that it was a superpower in a unipolar world. Now the world has changed. We now live in a multipolar world. There are different pockets of power, and a country like China is on the rise, ready to reverse the hegemony of the United Nations. Politically, or rather of the US of America, sorry, not United Nations. Politically, culturally, economically, and otherwise. We have written extensively on the subject, but the point we want to lift from that is that we must not find a situation where Africa finds itself having to swap oppressors. We have seen recent developments also of racism against Africans in China. And we need to ensure that as China becomes the hegemon of the world, we as Africans do not suffer. And you can see now that China now and the US are now fighting because the US does not want to accept that China is taking over. They say when two elephants are fighting, it is the grass that suffers. But when those elephants are making love, it is the grass that pays the bill. Now we need to ensure that Africa does not pay the bill of a shift in hegemony from the US to China. And one of the important things to track now is the whole issue of China beginning to occupy the African political economy. As we can see that in the continent, everywhere you go, you see a lot of Chinese presence mushrooming. One of the things we need to check over and above the economy is this question, for instance, of culture also. We don't want a situation where English gets replaced by Mandarin in Africa as a lingua franca. And that is a possibility if we are not careful. So the African Union must begin to put its eyes on this question. And one of the elements to put their eyes on is the whole question of ensuring that we take a resolution that is sustainable, of ensuring that we adopt an African lingua franca, to impose an African language on the situation, which should become a language of trade, a language of commerce, and a language of cultural communication amongst Africans. And if Kiswahili is still the popular language, we should take a resolution around it, but not just a paper resolution, a resolution to develop the language. It can serve its full purpose in the African context. And for me, that is one of the cardinal elements of defining an antithesis to white supremacy through culture. And as you know, language is a conveyor belt of culture. So that's an important thing of where to begin, because language is an important propeller of a lot of things to happen in the development of a society. So as we redefine language, we must not miss that point. As we redefine the African continent alongside the fall of white supremacy, we must not miss that cardinal point. The other thing that we need to deal decisively with is the whole issue of corruption in the continent. We are electing a lot of leaders who are very corrupt and stealing resources from government coffers, who should be using that money for development. So as we deal with all of these issues, we need to manage the issue of corruption amongst African leaders. that's an important matter to flag, and perhaps the detail is in engaging on it voluminously. The other question that I think we must not miss in where to begin in defining an antithesis to white supremacy is the whole question of leadership in the African continent. Our view is that we need to talk frankly about this question of ensuring that we replace this bad leadership that is there in the continent with quality, youthful leadership. You know, as you look at global politics in the world today, a lot of countries in Europe, in the Middle East, are beginning to realize the need to bring in fresh young leaders to run their countries with fresh ideas that would be able to respond, for instance, to the avant-garde of the fourth industrial revolution, which we know that the current leaders in our continent are aging, will not be able to grapple with. Now, it's important that we talk about the need to adopt the slogan of all quality youthful leadership to the front for the resolution of the problems of the continent. Because it is these young leaders with new ideas that will be able to confront this question of building an antithesis to white supremacy in a manner that talks with nimble feet on how to respond to the challenges that face Africa today. For me, as we define where to begin, those are issues we certainly must not miss. The other one, which I made as a point earlier, is the whole question of petitioning the African Union to revisit the discussion on the UN Security Council and the issue of a permanent seat for Africa. Because it has been dismissed in the past as just an academic debate. We need to make sure that we move now from the slogan of academia to substance in ensuring that there is indeed a resolution that Africa must have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council with the veto powers that other permanent members have. That's an important question we must not miss, because it doesn't help that when the UN Security Council sits, Africa is on the sidelines or comes in as a non-permanent member with no veto powers. Because now we cannot veto military action that have negative effects on our continent that are taking place in our shores. To recognize the point that some of the wars that are happening in our continent happen because the Western powers are fighting over our minerals. And I think this revisits the discussion set by Professor Campbell on the need to go back to the vision of Nkrumah around a common also military system, rather a military army for the continent, so that we can define how we are going to defend our minerals in the continent. A lot of wars that are fought in the continent are proxy wars of the West fighting over African minerals in the continent. And I'm saying that as we talk about where to begin, this whole question of looking at the Nkrumah common military system in the continent to defend what is ours is very important, because these Western powers just fly over us and do what they want, because they know that we do not have an army that is organized in a united fashion to defend what is ours in the continent. And I'm saying, therefore, that in all the things that we do, that is where to begin, so that this does not become just a talk shop. So that we have to lift also this point that we must petition the African Union to go back and defend and really demand that we must sit on the UN Security Council for purposes of ensuring that we are elevated to permanent membership. So those are the remarks that I want to make in conclusion. Maybe the last point is to say that on behalf of the Kgodiso Setšhaba Foundation, this was an inaugural discussion on this channel. We would love to have more of these discussions, and indeed there's many more to come, so that we are able to engage decisively on matters that define who we are as a people in the continent, but most importantly on concrete solutions of how we resolve, the euphoria. Beyond the symbolism, of wanting to just remove statues of Cecil John Rhodes, of who was De La Rey in De La Reyville. We need to say, beyond the slogans and the symbolism, concretely what needs to be done. And I think this is the kind of platform we need to create on a regular basis. And we are resolving that at least once a quarter, we must have a discussion like this to track what is happening in this terrain, so that we are able to contribute to the discussions and the discourse that is happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tato Mahokodi, for giving us those closing remarks, and at the same time by giving us a task to say where we should begin, and as well to raise the issue of leadership, as Professor Horace Campbell has raised, Sister Desta as well raising the role of women, and as well as to just pick up all those brains that as South Africa hosting this, we must not abscond our role as the chair of the African Union. We must not abscond our role as well as sitting at the United Nations Security Council. So I think this was one of the eye-openers of the webinar, and we want to thank everybody, and to just add to one of the attendees, which is Ndluli, who said that Tato, he does second you on the question of the language, Kiswahili, how we must use it as one of our lingua franca, or the language of communication, taking into account that Professor Horace Campbell has traveled Tanzania, has been to Zimbabwe, has been to Uganda. He's very familiar with all those issues of the language, but I think he has even challenged us on the militarization of the American system in the world. And as we have said, even Tato, that the superpowers are shifting now, becoming either China or America. And we're able to see it even in this COVID-19 situation. And I think the last point that you have raised, that you have challenged us on the question of even corruption in the continent. How do we deal with the issues of corruption and the issues of ailing and aging leaders in the continent? On that note, I think we'll want to thank everybody who has joined us on the Facebook page of General Kwembu, and as well as to thank our national broadcaster, SABC, to be able to can transmit and disseminate this knowledge, as we are saying, hashtag Africans United Against Racism, Black Lives are Precious, and as well as to say that the gender-based violence that we see in the world, we want to condemn it in all strongest possible terms. And Tato, we want to thank you once more with the team from Kgodiso Setšhaba for invoking the spirit of all ancestors of Africa, all the leaders of Africa, from Angola to Zimbabwe, including the Caribbeans, those who have fought, your Marcus Garvey or Walter Rodney, and many more, even the women of our continent. On that note, I want to thank everybody. And as we are looking towards the June 16, let this debate inspire us as we enter the June 16. As we have said, it will not be the talking shop, but will be walking the talk. And at the same time, to even say to the family of George Floyd, we are still saying we are with you wherever you are. And South Africa will still take that banner, and at the same time, that torch of pushing African unity first. And at the same time, like we are saying, the statute, it's not all about the statute, whether it's in Kimberley, whether it's in Belgium, whether it's in America, but the consciousness that must be instilled in the young people. On that note, I want to say asante sana, realeboha, kweri ma Africa, Africa unite for the sake of your children and for the benefit of your elders.
From Cape to Cairo, from Morocco to Madagascar, from Cape to Cairo, from Morocco to Madagascar.